Hey and welcome to State of the Hack. I'm Nick Carr.
And I'm Christopher Glyer.
And we're here for a little special episode to talk APT41 with Ray Leong and Jackie O'Leary. So welcome. I think Jackie's our first return guest, if I'm correct there. So she joined us previously to talk on which report did we talk about?
APT38. So check that video out if you haven't already.
So we're gonna deep dive on APT41, give you a little bit up front in case you haven't had a chance to read the report, and then get into some analytical questions from these two who did a ton of work over a long time to put this report together.
As well as some folks with questions on Twitter about the report. So
people sending questions. That was cool. And Flare couldn't be with us, but we're representing the awesome Flare team that was a big part of putting a report together. So thanks, Sicko, for the shirts. And to anyone else, you're still welcome to send us swag. We'll definitely wear it. But before we get started, a lot of times, as Jackie knows, we give a little bit of background about how you got into the field and kind of what you do here. So would you mind, even though people hopefully already saw your episode, just a little bit of what you do
just
here
as
and how
a
you got
refresher.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm Jackie. I'm on the advanced analysis team. I'm an analyst there. I've been with FireEye for about 4 years. Previous to that, I worked for the government. I didn't always start out in cybersecurity. I had the opportunity in 2013 to kind of move over, and I saw it as an industry that was growing a lot. So didn't have a formal kind of educational background, but decided to move over, and I've been doing it ever since.
Sweet. Ray.
Yeah, I've been with the company for about a year. Before that, or actually, the team I'm on the adversary pursuit team, which is part of FireEye's advanced practices team. So with the company for about a year, and before that, I was a senior cyber threat analyst at DoD, and also spent a couple years on the FBI cyber task force focused on nation-state cyber threats. And before that, I spent a couple years as an Army officer in both technical and traditional Army assignments.
Awesome. Sweet.
Yeah, so, jump right in the report. If you haven't read it, it's 68 pages long. And
that's an ungated PDF, so I was happy we did that too. You could just get it right there.
Peruse it. I mean, there's a lot in there.
Don't be scared by the page count, because we get into a lot of, there's an appendix with a lot of the technical details, but it's really solid.
I think it's one of the better reports that we've put out in quite a long time. The, just for those not familiar, APT41 is a, Chinese-based group that we track. They're a little unique in this perspective in that they pursue both espionage aims as well as, non-espionage games. I guess
Double Dragon.
There we go.
Saw the little logo.
So I don't know if you guys want to give us a brief overview or what do they need to know from the report about 41?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most interesting things is they're doing the espionage missions, but they're also pursuing financial gain for their own personal gain. We don't assess that that's driven by the state itself, but they're also using tools that we've kind of traditionally seen for espionage operations, also in those moonlighting operations for financial gain. They're also doing some really interesting supply chain activity. So in terms of the scope and scale of their operations, they've been pretty consistent over the last couple of years, which I think is interesting because we know that a lot of Chinese groups overall are kind of reorganizing and potentially shifting. So it's interesting to still see this group kind of consistently the last couple of years.
Is that notable? Do any other Chinese groups that we track, do we think do moonlighting on the side for personal gain, or is that common or uncommon?
It's uncommon as far as we can tell. And we haven't really seen kind of the split espionage financial motivation since APT38, which people have kind of likened this group to, but I think it's an important distinction that we're saying that, for something like APT38, which if you're not familiar, is a North Korean group that did a lot of financial hacking, that was directed by the North Korean state government, whereas we're saying the financial activity was, whereas we're saying that this is a nation-state group that pursues financial things for their own personal gain, not necessarily, with the knowledge of the state, or that's something that's kind of interesting to us, whether the state would know.
For sure. So any other key takeaways, I think, from the report? Like for me, at least, I know there's just years and years of experience that people have. I know Glyer led a bunch of IRs into these guys, and we've been responding for a while. So it was, I think, pretty cool for a lot of people internally and a lot of people in the community to see this group they're all familiar with. They're very busy.
Definitely. To your point, FireEye's been tracking this group since 2012. So there's approximately 30 different intrusions and investigations between managed incident responses, managed defense investigations, and 25 plus intrusions confirmed through telemetry. So the scale and that scope and pace of their operations is pretty impressive and consistent.
I think people asked, like Brian in Pittsburgh asked a question about the sophistication. If we just can hit up front, I think we all feel that they're
Sure.
a very sophisticated group, perhaps more sophisticated than some of the other APT groups that have been promoted recently. Just a little bit on like answering that question. Why do we think they're sophisticated, or what are the cool high-level takeaways there?
I think it's multi-component. On the technical end, we see some capabilities that we don't see a lot in various different groups. For instance, we see a lot of use of passive backdoors. So traditional backdoors will beacon out to command control server, and with the proper detections and signatures, they're easier to detect. But these passive backdoors, and they have 4 unique different families, they're often accompanied by a rootkit, kernel node rootkit component that listens for a specially crafted beacon from that C2 server before beaconing out. And not only that, when the communication is established, it'll drop that traffic, so it's much harder to detect. Other things, we've seen the use of bootkits for persistence. We don't always see that with a lot of different groups. So harder to detect, it loads the malicious code before the operating system loads. So without proper detections, that's a little bit more stealthy.
And those Linux rootkits and Windows bootkits, right?
Right.
Can you differentiate bootkits from rootkits for us?
Yeah, so rootkits are code that you would run that would be, the goal would be to hide something. You could hide a process of memory, you could hide the presence of a network connection, you could hide the file on disk. So there's different things that you could choose to hide, a registry key, et cetera, from the operating system itself. So rootkits, whether it's Windows or Linux, which we saw both, could be used in that manner. A bootkit is more, which is often coupled with a rootkit, is more about how you get code to load and loading prior to the operating system loading it. And so this group actually, some of what makes them stand out to me is our very first investigations of them going back to 2012. Especially in this time, Chinese APT groups typically were very cautious and reserved. And one of the things that made them stood out was we knew they had lots of capabilities, but they would only slowly increase their capabilities as they were pressed, and they would never jump to their best stuff. They'd start with kind of their, easy, tactics.
I think a
TTPs.
hallmark of sophistication is restraint.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they were incredibly restrained, and they would only progressively increase what they would do. Well, in these moonlighting operations, they would jump to their most advanced stuff, right? This was the first group that we ever saw actually use a bootkit. So we'd never seen one before, or at least in a real investigation. It's partly what helped us, or forced us to have to develop techniques, which we've since refined to actually find them at scale.
I think we put out a blog on that.
We put some blogs, on bootwhat. But like this group is actually that was the genesis of the initial research going all the way back to 2012, finding MBR bootkits and how to find that at scale.
Yeah, we just ran into Jay Smith as we were grabbing coffee on the Flare team, and he was talking about that process, because I was curious, like, how you even tell consultants to go out and find the MBR code. And it was...
it's a multi-step process. So even once you find that you have a malicious MBR, then you need a malware reverser to basically figure out like where are the bytes for the actual backdoor stored on disk. So either on allocated space or something else. So it's a multi-step process to even get to the bits that actually have the component, which is the backdoor, which isn't running in memory. So other things they did, they were, I think, the first group, if I remember correctly, that used cross-platform malware. So our network sensors in 2012, I remember an investigation where we were looking and we said, hey, this is a photo backdoor. What's this IP address? And they're like, oh, that's one of our Linux servers. And we're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. That was like a first for us. So Linux malware in 2012 that was actually written cross-platform, bootkits, rootkits, Windows and Linux, the passive backdoors, dead drop resolvers. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of one of the techniques that we see them use.
Sure, we see. So a lot of the first stage malware, sometimes second stage malware, will beacon out to a legitimate site such as GitHub, Microsoft TechNet, and these are legitimate websites that aren't going to flag as malicious in most sensors, but they have encoded either another C2 or executable code where they'll pull down, and then from there they have the true payload that could beacon out to another C2 or execute payload the code from there. So it's a layer of obfuscation to hide stages of execution for the malware.
Nice. I saw Steam community was listed on there too. I know there were some hanging questions there about like basically reached out to Steam community forums, and that was one of the interesting overlaps, I think, between their personal financial attacks against gaming companies and some of the espionage activity. But let's stop there. So they're very sophisticated. We have tons of background on them. So like, how do we decide to write this report? Or we've talked a little bit before about how we cluster and promote these groups, but I'm curious from Jackie's perspective.
Why aren't they a Fin group, for example?
Yeah, like how long did this take? Like, I know Katie Nichols was asking from MITRE. She was asking what the process of actually promoting it or graduating, or how to make that decision to do this.
Yeah, definitely. So I think to the first question about why isn't it a Fin group, I think anytime that we assess that there's some sort of connection to nation state sponsorship, or we believe they're conducting espionage missions, we elevate that to an APT group opposed to just a Fin group, which we see as purely financial. And we know they have that dual mission. For the process, obviously, we've talked about that we've been tracking this group since 2012, but in terms of how we kind of graduate the group, I would say we really, the research process is casting a wide net. So we're going back to that initial, compromises that we saw them. We're re-reviewing that activity. We're identifying potential clusters of uncategorized activity that we might want to combine or merge together. We prioritize those groups based on, which ones we think are most interesting. It's really to understand the actor from kind of cradle to grave. So we go back through all of our equities to see, what interesting tidbits we can kind of pull out. And also, I think a big part of it too is just seeing what the community is saying, reading OSINT, understanding how other vendors are tracking this group, so that we can define our assessment, but also understand how others have made that assessment.
Yeah, I thought you guys did a fantastic job in this particular report, referencing other work or helping people deconflict it, like what we do and don't track.
Yeah, so there are references to the Shadowpad and Shadowhammer attacks that Kaspersky talked about. I think ESET and some of their reports. So there were lots of different kind of references. Actually, one point I think that can be maybe confusing to those listening or in the community, or you may hear about like WinNTI and either a WinNTI umbrella group or malware, or like when you guys want to kind of walk through like at least what our view is on that and how we
that's another one
sort through
people
some
guilty
of
of using WinNTI to mean the group or the malware.
Right.
So WinNTI is a malware family we track internally as High Noon, and we saw it first used around at 2013. And since then, we see separate, individual, and distinct Chinese cluster groups use this malware. And we don't attribute by malware alone. We look at multiple data points: infrastructure, TTPs, malware, and targeting. So for instance, we see APT41 use High Noon. We see APT41 use High Noon, and several uncategorized groups as well. So we describe High Noon / WinNTI more as a malware family that's used by multiple groups, not a group itself.
So then in terms of like, if someone's talking about the umbrella group, are they more referring then to kind of the overlaps that maybe between 17, 41, 20, probably. 30, like those kind of...
Maybe that image that pops up a little bit behind us with the malware overlaps, is that what we think other people are referring to? Or it's too hard to figure out what
if that's a primary data point, you're using a piece of malware and that's shared, then you are going to clump several groups of distinct activity into one umbrella group, WinNTI.
So like, Jackie, the way I think of it internally, like at any point, if I have a sample that we have attributed, like it's really easy as a FireEye employee to just say like, have I seen this before? As an IR consultant, or who is this attributed to? Or who do we suspect it is? Like, we make that really easy with our graph and with the modeling that the pursuit team does on all of our engagements. Like, that's easy. But what did it look like to turn all of that data, especially for so many years and so many investigations, into this report? Like, how long did it take to make this glossy thing?
Yeah, I think when we hit the ground running, we probably started, Ray's team started, I believe, in April, and my team kind of started in May. And it's a pretty formal process once we start, but I think by mid-June we are writing. We just try to collect as much information as possible. And then also for things like going back through those IRs, those really interesting tidbits that maybe made it into a report but were never publicly known, that's the stuff that we want to pull out. We want to start understanding, what industries in particular the group is going after, what case studies we can kind of pull out, how broad the group is in terms of geography, things like that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, like, so reading the report and having lived through a bunch of the different response engagements, we almost saw them start as purely financial in terms of at least our, view of the world and what we see. There could be sample bias there, but then seeing them actually then mostly start there and then kind of evolve into and add espionage related things over time, I thought was kind of, interesting or notable. They also had there were a bunch of you guys talked about the supply chain attacks. So you may have seen in the news things about Netserang or Asus and the compromise, potentially some overlaps with CCleaner. Actually, do you guys want to talk about kind of maybe summarize a little bit like what we talked about in the report about CCleaner and what we know or at least don't know? Because that was one of the ones that was a little bit more...
And if you like this, there's a whole supply chain compromise section of the report. But yeah, if you could give an overview of that deconfliction, that'd be great.
Sure. So with CCleaner, we didn't fully attribute it to APT41. There are some suspicions, but we don't have that within our APT1 cluster for several reasons. Well, first, although they use a TeamViewer as initial entry intrusion vector, which APT41 has used previously, they use domain generation algorithms for first stage C2. They use dead drop resolver C2s for the second stage. But then the second stage payload is a malware family we call Black Coffee, and that's been used by several Chinese malware groups. And we tried to...
Flare, this one here, right?
Yeah, so Flare did a very deep dive on this malware family, looking for unique overlaps in code reuse that we've seen APT41 use in several supply chain compromises. Asus, Netserang, and they weren't present in this malware family, so it gave us enough pause where if we attribute something to APT41, we want to have high confidence across multiple data points, and that wasn't high confidence enough for us from our view.
Yeah, so it seems like we try our best. Our goal is to roll as many uncategorized clusters into here and frankly not branch into a bunch of different APT groups, right? So if you guys had tackled this and seen that it was APT17, it would have been an update report for that this is APT17. I know that doesn't really apply, but so it involves a deep dive on malware, hence wearing the Flare shirt. So who was involved in that primarily? The big review was Willie Ballantine and...
Yeah, Willie Ballantine, Carlos, Tyler Dean, Tobias Kruger, Mike Drakovich, so lots of the team.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm missing people that also gave a hand.
I didn't mean to surprise you with
that. But they did an amazing effort. Part of the graduation process was we wanted to make sure we cleanly classify a lot of these malware families that APT41 uses. They use a high number of both custom and public malware families, and we wanted to make sure we could clean it up a little bit as we had suspicions that some of these malware families fell into an overarching main malware family with various subvariants. So throughout this process, Flare identified unique overlaps in code reuse, unique encoding algorithms, identical control and flow structures. So for example, High Noon, there is the highnoon.bin variant, the highnoon.light variant, the highnoon.passive, highnoon.linux. So all within the same code family, but distinct subvariants.
Yeah. A couple of things that kind of stood out to me in the report. There were two personas that we talked about. One which is probably more of a moniker, and then the other one which could be somebody's real name, may not be. Do you guys want to go into a little bit about kind of what we talked about or what we found and maybe the significance of that? Or
Yeah, so we found two personas, Wolfji and then Zhang. For Zhang, we saw evidence that kind of lent to our assessment that we believe that these personas were contractors. So we saw in 2009, one of them actually advertised kind of hacker for hire services in Chinese language forums, and also talked about the development of an injection tool. So those were things that kind of lent to our assessment that these were probably individuals who, were offering their services for hire.
I think Sweet Hack on Twitter was asking about that, the contractor status. I know there's a little blurb in the report, but where are we at with considerations of whether we thought they were a contractor or directly employed, or what's your analytical assessment personally?
Yeah, so we don't have a connection to a specific state organization. Our assessment is that they're contractors because of things that we talked about previously, like the hacker for hire posts in particular. We also acknowledge the fact that there's probably more risk involved with being a state employee and moonlighting for financial gain, especially using those tools versus being a contractor. So that's something that kind of factored into our analysis, and as we mentioned previously, lends the question of whether the Chinese government was kind of aware of this activity.
Yeah, well, that was the thing I was looking for technical data points on, whether they had to be aware of it, and there was some interesting areas where they compromised the game companies. Do they use the M game
Yeah.
Not end game.
Yeah,
M game.
M is in Mary. M game. There's a gaming company that they, a thing they did, pretty commonly was they would have, break into a gaming company, steal their code signing certificates that a developer is obviously going to have, and then use that to sign their malware. I thought it was particularly interesting in the report that the same companies, signing certs were also used to sign malware that APT17 used, APT20, APT31.
So that seems to be another indication it's supporting espionage and that someone was aware of it, right? And at least in the one case, the M-game certificate, I thought signing APT41 stuff, like, it's not like you can just roll into work and have code signing certs and no one's going to ask questions about it. So it seems like, a tacit understanding that this side hustle is going on for APT41.
Yeah.
There's some sort of level of collusion between these state-sponsored groups from China.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of other things that stood out in the report for me. Do you want to talk about a little more on the supply chain aspect of things? Because I think that, at least at the time when there were a lot of these supply chain attacks, like, it was hard to kind of piece together. And I thought the report did a really good job kind of telling a broader narrative of how they all kind of work together and some of the details there.
I think some of the interesting details was on the Asus supply chain compromise. We weren't able to independently verify the first stage, but it was the second stage that we attributed to APT41. And what was interesting about the second stage was it delivered something we track as poisonplug.shadow. But in order to fully execute, it needed a seed for an RC5 key. And that was from that system's volume serial ID. So that's unique
to that specific system.
To that system. And without it, it wouldn't execute and call out to the second stage, C2. But our friends in Flare were able to brute force that, extract the payload. It was Poison Plug, and it called out to a Google Docs website. And we were able to independently verify that website or that Google Docs was created by an account, hrsimon59 at gmail.com. And that was an attributed previously account to APT41. And along with that data point, the unique routines of the malware, those TTPs, we were able to say with high enough confidence that second stage was APT41.
Yeah, it took us this long to bring up guardrails on State of the Hack, but yeah, the use of those in the supply chain compromises makes sense.
Right.
It seems really cool. That's pretty sweet that Flare brute forced that as well.
And it's not just something we're seeing in supply chain compromises. We're working with a client in Asia. Just last month, we're seeing the same techniques where the Poison Plug payload needed that specific volume serial ID to execute. So it's something that they continue to use.
So you want to go through a little bit maybe, so we've talked some of how they've made, hackers for hire, at least on the, on their own side. What are some of the things they've done on the espionage side in terms of, advancing, Chinese state aims?
Yeah, so we've seen them interested in high-tech entities in particular, which we know aligns with China's Made in 2025 plan to kind of advance their R&D. We've also seen them interested in healthcare entities, things like medical devices and biotech in particular, which we know is also an element of Made in 2025 or Made in China 2025.
And are we seeing those recently, or it seems like we saw a lot of the personal financial attacks early in that 2012, 2013, starting that time, but are we still seeing both sets of activity, like espionage and personal gain still? I know we're responding to 41, and Managed Defense is working something and going to hopefully blog about that soon.
I think that's an interesting data point is earlier this year, it was at a large U.S. research institution, and we think that was more lended towards the espionage type work. And they had leveraged a specific vulnerability. I think you had done some research into it.
Yeah, so our vulnerability team on the Intel side looked into it and actually was able to locate the proof of concept exploit code that was publicly available. I think it was April 11th maybe, and then the next day we actually saw APT41 leverage that exploit against that research entity. So that shows kind of their resourcefulness.
And as a hint of some of their TTPs, once they were able to get remote code execution on that web server, Europe China chopper, first they used the legitimate tool, CertUtil, to download China Chopper and to download High Noon. And our friends at Flare reversed High Noon traffic, saw them download AceHash. It's a Mimikatz like credential dumping tool, doing a lot of initial reconnaissance on that machine, what's running, what's it connected to, etc. But our managed defense analyst, between the first intrusion to when we were able to triage and report to the client, was under 2 hours. So then this client was able to then contain the host before any lateral movement happened.
Yeah, and those for not familiar, China Chopper is a web shell. What makes it pretty unique or interesting or difficult to detect is it's basically a JavaScript eval statement, or there's a couple different languages you could use, but it's like 10 characters long or 15 characters long, and it's actually short enough that you can't write an antivirus signature for it because you'd catch so many other things. And all the functionality of it is actually implemented, say, in JavaScript, but on the client side. So you connect to this potentially with a password, and then you basically load all the functionality and it remotely runs it. So it's something that we see lots of different groups use, nation state, non-nation state, et cetera. But China Choppers are always really interesting because it's so difficult to find, and it's particularly effective. So
I thought what was kind of interesting and great, it was the multiple detection angles from that incident. So we saw a signature flag on the use of CertUtil to download software. We saw a signature flag on China Chopper commands. And then we saw them use an IP address that they previously used in a different intrusion. So we caught them on multiple angles and in a good enough time.
So I think it's cool you mentioned that they're watching the public exploits and using them so quickly. We believe, and we were talking about whether or not we thought the Chinese government is aware of their side hustle. I guess they are now, right? Because we expect they read the APT41 report. Do we actually know? Do we know that's the case?
So we do have an IP address that we previously attributed to APT41, and we saw them access the report. So they read the APT41 report, but they also read about their friends at APT40, so maybe some personal connections there. And then they looked at the Flare challenge coming on. So
nice.
Maybe we might have some
participants.
Yeah.
Yep, give them some RC5 brute forcing and see if it looks familiar.
On the one thing I'd like to touch on a little bit is like, when they would try and do things for profit, like how would they monetize that, or how do we actually think they were profiting from targeting?
And how much money? Do we know how much?
Yeah, so earlier on, we saw them target a lot of the virtual, like, in-game currency. So in one instance, I think in a matter...
This is all, like, pre-Bitcoin type,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I think in maybe 2013 or 2015 maybe, in the span of 3 hours, kind of in one client, they went after this virtual in-game currency and generated, I think, thousands of dollars of this in-game currency, and then, laundered it, sold it on the black market. And we don't know for sure, but we could estimate that's probably somewhere between 100,000 to 300,000 in terms of profit from that, just that alone. We've also seen other instances where they attempted to go after in-game currency, they weren't successful, and then they actually tried to deploy something like ransomware, which is super interesting. It wasn't successful, but they obviously didn't give up on a financial gain.
And you guys actually saw that they use ransomware as a service there, right? With like a 20% uplift. Like we've talked a lot about the ransomware as a service thing here. I was kind of disappointed to see APT41 going that route, just because they're so interesting and so sophisticated. Not to overuse it, but like that. I guess everyone does that because it works and a quick monetization scheme. So
yeah, and I think more recently they've kind of moved away from those virtual in-game currencies, at least from our observations, but they're doing things like we saw them compile XMRig, which is a Monero cryptocurrency mining tool. We've also seen them do some spear phishing to a cryptocurrency exchange, so maybe their interests are kind of moving in that direction now.
It's probably like less work and effort to target a cryptocurrency exchange, or
I guess.
Right?
Come on, don't some more into it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we wanted to hit. If anything else you guys wanted to highlight, definitely, again, read the report. It's good.
It's really
Looks
good.
Anything we didn't hit on that you wanted to flag?
Maybe just briefly, some of the unique third-party intrusion vectors we saw.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, at multiple clients, we saw them leverage TeamViewer as an initial entry method, and right afterwards drop Crosswalk or High Noon. And TeamViewer publicly admitted they did suffer an intrusion, but they've since remediated, strengthened their networks. And that kind of jives with what we saw. We saw TeamViewer stop being used as an intrusion mechanism back in fall 2018.
So when we say used, like, I mean, they came in with, we traced it back, and the furthest back we got was TeamViewer, and that they came in with credentials.
Yeah, legitimate credentials through TeamViewer.
I think something interesting that we're seeing from the group kind of most recently trend-wise is they seem to be conducting some sort of kind of surveillance operation. So we see them targeting telecom, going after things like call, data records, and text messages. We've also seen them compromise a hotel, and in one instance they were able to gain access to kind of reservation information. So we
Very
assess
helpful
that's
for
probably was
espionage, yeah.
Right.
doing something before a high-ranking Chinese official was actually visiting. So they seem to kind of be focused in that direction as of late.
Any plans to talk more about the SMS-based data targeting?
So Dan Perez and I will be presenting at CDS a more deeper dive on APT41 technical TTPs and malware capabilities. And this malware family, we call it message tap. And we're going to dive deeper into how it identifies keywords and specific people of interest in these telecoms.
Sweet.
Nice.
What about you? Like, what are you working on now after this? Like, as if this wasn't enough, a 68-page report.
She's
Yeah.
gonna take a break and rest.
Yeah, definitely. After the rest, I think we're going back to kind of look at China from a holistic perspective. So how things have changed since the reorg. What do we know about China kind of writ large? Groups that we were once seeing all the time, are they still active? And what does that say about, post-Xi agreement?
Awesome.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for your time, and
Thanks for
Yeah.
joining.
appreciate the
Cheers.
joining us.
Oh, and you guys are doing a webinar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
If you're checking this out now, there's a webinar coming up where you guys are going to deep dive and go through the report in more detail. So please check that out. All right, back to the cheers.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Cheers.